The flashbulbs were still popping when two federal agents grabbed my father by the shoulders of his tuxedo and slammed him face first onto a table covered in white linen and shattered crystal. 30 seconds earlier, he'd been laughing mid-toast, telling a senator's aide how easy this whole night was going to be. I lowered my hand from the podium microphone and said 4 quiet words into the radio clipped under my jacket. Move in. Cuff him. My name is Mia Sinclair. I'm 31 years old. And for most of my life, my own family made me feel like an embarrassment they had to hide from their rich friends. My dad called me a nobody. My brother told people I pushed papers for the government. My sister-in-law once said to my face in front of a room full of people that I wasn't fit to stand next to their name. They had no idea who I actually was. They had no idea that the low-level government employee they mocked for 11 straight years held a security clearance that outranked half the room they were standing in that night. They had no idea I was the one federal official standing between their $680 million defense deal and the country finding out exactly what they'd done to get it. Before I tell you how I watched my own family get dragged out of the biggest night of their lives in handcuffs, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if you believe karma always collects on its debts, eventually hit that subscribe button because silent revenge is just getting started, and trust me, this one gets worse before it gets so much better. Let's rewind. 1 week earlier. Before I take you back to that dinner table, you need to understand something about the 11 years before it because none of what happened next makes sense without it. I grew up the quiet one. The one who didn't need the room to look at her. My brother Derek was the golden child from the day he was born. First at everything, loudest at everything, the one my dad took to football games and business dinners so people could see the family legacy in training. I was the kid who spent summers at my grandfather's farmhouse upstate, learning how to fix old radios in his workshop while my parents were off building a social calendar I was never quite polished enough to be part of. Grandpa Walt used to tell me, "Mia, the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one." I didn't understand what he meant until I was 22 years old, sitting in a federal training facility, learning how power actually works in this country, quietly behind closed doors, far away from any chandelier. I kept my job secret from my family for over a decade. Not because I was ashamed of it. Because the one time I tried to explain it, back at Derek's engagement dinner, my dad cut me off mid-sentence to toast his son's real accomplishments. So I stopped trying. I let them believe whatever made them comfortable, and every single year that story got a little crueler, a little more dismissive, and I let it happen because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted them to be proud of me on their own terms without me having to prove it. That part of me finally died at a dinner table over rack of lamb, and honestly, good riddance. I was standing in my parents' dining room in Great Falls, Virginia, watching my dad slice into a rack of lamb like he was performing surgery on it. The chandelier above the table threw gold light over the whole scene, the wine, the china, the smug satisfaction radiating off every single person at that table except me. My brother Derek was 35 and ran a private equity shop called Ironclad Capital that specialized in one thing: getting rich men government contracts. He leaned back in his chair, swirling scotch he definitely didn't need a fourth glass of, and announced to the table like he was reading a headline out loud. "It's done," he said. The Ironvale deal. $680 million. The Department of Defense just handed us the whole program. His wife, Vanessa, actually squealed. She was wearing enough jewelry to fund a small country, and she clapped her hands together like a kid who'd just been told Disneyland was closing early just for her. "We're finally getting that place in Aspen," she said. "Derek can't keep flying commercial. It's beneath him now." My mom, Diane, beamed at both of them like they'd just cured cancer. "You two deserve every bit of this," she cooed. "It takes real vision to make it in this town." My dad, Gerald Sinclair, a man who'd spent 30 years running a government relations firm that was really just a polite word for professional bribery, nodded like a king accepting tribute. "It takes knowing exactly which hands to shake and which ones to fill," he said. "We beat out 2 rival firms for this. Ironvale is ours." I sat there and said nothing. 'Cause they were talking about a federal cybersecurity project I had personally flagged 3 weeks earlier as a critical national security risk. They had no idea they were bragging about it to the one person in Washington who actually had the authority to kill it. Vanessa turned to me with that fake sweet smile she saves for when she's about to be cruel. So, Mia, how's the basement treating you? I don't work in a basement, I said calmly. I work in a secure federal facility. She waved her hand like she was swatting a fly. Basement, cubicle, whatever it's called. Did you finally get a real office, or are you still fixing routers for 4-star generals? Derek snorted into his scotch. That's a generous way of describing changing people's passwords. What do they even pay you now, Mia? 50 grand. I didn't correct him. I never did. Secrecy had been the foundation of my entire adult life, and honestly, at that point, I'd stopped expecting them to ask a real question about my job. They never had. Not once in 11 years. My mom sighed dramatically, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a napkin like she was auditioning for a soap opera. Look at you, Mia. 31 years old, and you still haven't given us one single thing to brag about. Your brother's building an empire and you're just standing off to the side of it. Do you have any idea how hard it is to explain what you do at a party? Vanessa added, I tell people you work for the government and they picture someone important. I have to correct them. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Under the table, my smartwatch buzzed once against my wrist, a notification I ignored for now. I'd get to that. Are congratulations really necessary tonight, Dad? I asked quietly. You just told the table you beat out 2 rival firms for a defense contract. That's not exactly modest. My dad's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Table went quiet for a beat too long. Then he set the fork down, slow and deliberate, and I felt the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Since you brought it up, he said, there's something you can actually do for this family for once. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, sliding it across the table until it stopped in front of my water glass. I looked down. It was a property transfer agreement for my late grandfather's farmhouse in upstate New York. 80 acres. The one piece of this family's wealth that had never touched my dad's hands because Grandpa Walt had left it to me directly, in a will my dad had contested and lost. Sign it, my dad said. Tonight. I have a notary in the study. Why do you need my grandfather's house? I asked. You just said you're sitting on $680 million. Derek leaned forward, using the tone he probably used on interns. You don't get how deals like this actually close, Mia. A signature isn't enough. There's an entire layer of costs nobody ever puts on paper. Vanessa's eyes lit up like she was talking about a shoe sale. You have to keep the right people happy, honey. That's just how this town runs. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You're talking about bribes. We call it moving the deal along, Derek said, completely unbothered, like he was correcting my grammar. The firm's books get combed through every quarter. We can't run that kind of money through our own accounts without somebody asking questions. But your farmhouse? Clean. No liens. No ties to us. It's the perfect collateral for a private loan from a few overseas partners. You want to use my grandfather's land, I said slowly, to bankroll bribes for a federal defense contract. It's temporary, Derek snapped. We borrow against it, we take care of our people, we close Iron Vale, and the government payment clears the loan in 4 months. Nobody ever has to know. And if the deal falls apart? If your overseas partners decide to just keep the land? It won't fall apart, Vanessa said, rolling her eyes. We're at the head table at the Iron Vale Gala next week. The Secretary of Defense is announcing it himself. This is happening, Mia. Stop making it difficult. My mom reached over and patted my hand like she was soothing a toddler. Honestly, Mia, this is exactly the problem. You never think past your own little corner of the world. Your dad and your brother are building something enormous, and all they're asking is to borrow a house you haven't set foot in for years. Is that really so much to give this family just once? I looked around that table. For people I loved, or used to, casually confessing to federal bribery over rack of lamb like it was small talk about the weather. And they genuinely believed I was too small, too invisible, too irrelevant to understand exactly what they'd just admitted to. You want me to hand over my only inheritance, I said, so you can fund international fraud. My dad slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. Watch your tone in my house. This is how business actually gets done in this city, whether you like it or not. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your degree. You've spent your whole life coasting off what I built, and the least you can do is give something back. Derek stood up, looming over the table, and pointed a finger at my face. Sign it tonight, Mia, or I promise you I will make your life miserable. I know people. I can have you out of a job by Monday morning. I can drag you through court until you're broke. I picked up the pen. I looked at the signature line. And then, very deliberately, I set the pen down and slid the folder back to the center of the table. I'm not signing this, I said. I'm not handing over my grandfather's land so you can fund a federal crime. If you're new to silent revenge, this is usually the part where the family loses their minds. And trust me, they did not disappoint. My brother erupted, calling me ungrateful, spineless, a coward hiding behind a government badge that meant nothing. My sister-in-law told me I'd always been the weak link, the one who never understood what family actually owed each other. My mom cried real tears, the kind that are more about being watched than about actually feeling anything, over how her husband had worked his whole life to provide for a daughter who couldn't do one simple favor. And my dad stood up slow, buttoned his jacket, and looked at me the way you'd look at something you'd scraped off your shoe. You've got until midnight, he said, to sign that deed or you're done in this family. Erased. Do you understand me? I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood up and reached for my coat. That's when he played his last card. He walked to the wall safe behind the family portrait, spun the dial, and pulled out 4 cream envelopes embossed in gold. VIP invitations to the Iron Veil Gala at Meridian Hall, the biggest national security event of the year. Politicians. Generals. Cameras everywhere. There were 5 of these, he said, holding the 4th one up to the light. I pulled strings to get a 5th seat. For you. I was going to let you sit there and watch your family become untouchable. Then he looked at Vanessa. Call your mother tonight, he said. Tell Roberta she's got a seat at our table instead. Vanessa actually gasped with joy and snatched the envelope out of his hand like it was a diamond ring. My mom looked me up and down, taking in my plain blazer and flat shoes, and let out the short, cruel little laugh. It really is for the best. You'd stick out like a sore thumb in that room. You just don't carry yourself like the people who'll be there. I stood in that foyer, coat buttoned, and let every single one of those words land without flinching. And then I walked out of that house without a single tear because the version of me that needed their approval had already died somewhere around dessert. What none of them saw, what none of them will ever know until this exact moment, is that on my way to the door I walked straight through the living room where my brother's work laptop sat wide open on the credenza. Green still glowing. He'd been so confident, so untouchable, that he hadn't even bothered to lock it before dinner. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even turn my head. A tiny device, no bigger than a fingernail, slid into that port without a sound, and 20 seconds later, an entire hard drive's worth of emails, encrypted messages, and offshore banking records was sitting safely on a server my family didn't even know existed. They thought they'd just thrown away an inconvenient daughter. They had actually just handed federal evidence to the one person in Washington with the authority to end them. Comment below if you saw that coming, because I promise you, what I found on that hard drive was so much worse than bribery. Here's what my family never bothered to ask about my actual job in 11 years. I'm the Director of National Cyber Defense Operations. I answer directly to the Secretary of Defense. Every major digital infrastructure contract in this country, including Iron Veil, needs my personal sign-off before it goes anywhere near a signature. My father thought he was manipulating a system. He didn't realize I was the system. That night, I drove straight to my facility outside Arlington, a secure building with retinal scanners, a server room kept at a steady 60 degrees, and exactly 0 traces of the cheap government cubicle my family loved to imagine I worked in. I sat down at my terminal, cracked my brother's laughably weak encryption in about the time it takes to microwave popcorn, and started pulling apart his files one folder at a time. The bribery was all there. Wire transfers, shell companies in Cyprus, spreadsheets labeling illegal payments as consulting fees. That alone was enough to put my dad and brother away for a very long time. But buried in a hidden partition, the kind built to erase itself if you opened it the wrong way, I found something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. A memorandum. Foreign letterhead. A known front for a hostile overseas intelligence operation. My dad and brother hadn't just been bribing officials to win the Ironvale contract. They had agreed, in writing, to quietly build a security flaw directly into the system. A backdoor. One that would blind our early warning defense network for a window of several critical minutes, in exchange for an additional off-the-books payment funneled through offshore crypto accounts. I sat there in the blue glow of that monitor and felt something in me go completely cold and completely still. This wasn't bribery anymore. This was treason. My hands actually went cold reading it. I read the paragraph 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding the language, hoping some part of my brain would find a version of this that wasn't what it so obviously was. It wasn't a misunderstanding. My family had agreed on paper to help a hostile foreign operation punch a hole straight through the early warning system meant to protect every single soldier this country has stationed overseas. Not by accident. Not through negligence. On purpose, in exchange for a number with too many zeros on it, wired through accounts designed to never be traced back to a Sinclair. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of that server room for a long time, listening to the hum of the cooling fans, trying to reconcile the 2 versions of my father living in my head, the one who used to carry me on his shoulders at the county fair, and the one who had just agreed in writing to sell out American soldiers for a beach house in Aspen. Only one of those men was real. I just hadn't wanted to see him clearly until that exact moment. And there was one more video file buried at the bottom of that folder dated 5 months earlier. Private meeting overseas. My brother's voice, smug and confident, telling the men across the table, "My sister works low level at defense. She's clueless. We use her name and her clearance history to fast-track this past the vendor screening. If anyone ever asks questions, the trail leads straight to her, not us." They were planning to frame me. I called my best friend and deputy, Nora Bishop, an FBI cyber forensics analyst I'd trusted since our first week at the academy, and told her to get to a secure line immediately. When she saw the files, she went quiet for a long moment before saying exactly 4 words. "Mia, this is treason." I know. And I was about to make sure the entire country found out at the worst possible moment for the people who did it. If this story is giving you chills already, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think, and trust me, we are just getting to the good part. Here's where things almost went sideways. 2 days into building the federal case with Nora and a joint task force out of the Pentagon, I discovered something that made my blood run colder than the treason file had. Someone inside my own agency had been feeding information back to my father's firm for months, quietly flagging which contracts were under review, which officials were clean, which ones could be bought. Took Nora and me a sleepless night of digging to trace it back to a mid-level analyst named Curtis Halloway, a guy I'd worked beside for 3 years and genuinely trusted. Curtis wasn't just careless. He'd been paid $20,000 a month, wired through an account that traced straight back to Ironclad Capital. My own brother had a mole sitting 4 cubicles down from mine the entire time. We didn't arrest Curtis right away. We let him keep feeding bad information back to my family, except now every piece of intel he sent was intel we controlled. My family thought they had eyes inside the federal government. There was one night that almost blew the whole operation. Curtis stayed late at the office, later than usual, and I caught him standing over my terminal, trying to peek at a case file he had no clearance to touch. I remember standing in that doorway, my pulse pounding, wondering if he'd already figured out we were onto him, wondering if one wrong move from me would send a warning straight to my father's phone before the task force was even in position. I didn't confront him. I just asked him, calm as anything, if he'd finished the Ironvale compliance report yet, and watched his shoulders drop with relief as he realized I hadn't noticed a thing. He had no idea I'd already flagged every keystroke on that machine for the last 3 days straight. They had no idea those eyes now worked for me. By the 5th day, the case was airtight. Sealed indictments. A joint FBI and Department of Justice task force standing by. General Marcus Reeves, a 4-star with 0 patience for corruption, personally signed off on the operational plan. There was only one place left to spring the trap: the Ironvale Gala at Meridian Hall, where my father and brother were about to stand in front of the Secretary of Defense, half the Senate, and a wall of television cameras, expecting to be crowned untouchable. I was going to let them get exactly that close to victory. And then I was going to take it all away in front of everyone who ever mattered to them. Stick around, because everything that happens from here is the entire reason I sat down to record this story. Which brings us back to that night. The one I opened this story with. I arrived at the entrance of Meridian Hall in a plain black gown, no jewelry, nothing that screamed money, because I never needed it to. My dad, my brother, Vanessa, and her mother Roberta pulled up in a car worth more than my grandfather's entire farmhouse, laughing about the deal, about their new estate, about how sorry they almost felt for leaving me behind. They walked past me in line like I was invisible. My dad actually turned to sneer at me one last time. "Call a cab home, Mia. Before you embarrass us." I said nothing. I stepped up to the hostess and set down a small black square about the size of a credit card. No shine, no insignia, nothing you'd look twice at, except for the chip buried inside it that made her scanner shriek red the instant it made contact. Her hands started shaking. She didn't walk toward the nearest ranking officer in the room, she ran. General Reeves turned, saw me, and snapped to full attention with a salute sharp enough to cut glass. "We've been expecting you, Director," he said, loud enough for the entire entrance to hear. I want you to picture my father's face in that exact moment. Picture the color draining out of it in real time. Picture my brother's mouth falling open mid-sentence. Picture Vanessa's jaw actually hitting the floor as a federal security detail pulled a velvet rope aside. For me, I'd spent 11 years being the quiet one, the one who ate dinner in silence while people who claimed to love me tore me apart across a table. I'd spent 11 years driving home alone after every holiday, replaying every insult, wondering what it would take to finally be enough for them. Standing at that entrance, watching a 4-star general salute me while my own father's mouth hung open in disbelief, I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time since I was a teenager. It wasn't joy exactly. It was quieter than that. It felt like putting down something impossibly heavy that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying my whole life. "There's been a mistake," my dad stammered, waving his gold invitation like it still meant something. "This is my daughter. She fixes computers." Nobody looked at him. Federal agents quietly moved my entire family into a glass security pen for secondary screening, and I walked past them toward the ballroom, while my family pounded on soundproof glass that nobody could hear. "Let them wait," I told the detail commander. "Let them have plenty of time to think about their seating arrangement." Half an hour later, they were released into the ballroom, flustered but still arrogant enough to reset their smiles for the cameras. My brother immediately cornered a group of senior officials to brag about practically running the Defense Department. My sister-in-law paraded around bragging to a group of senators' wives about her husband's 9-figure deal, never once noticing the undercover agents standing 3 feet away, listening to every single word. Then the Secretary of Defense's Chief of Staff stepped up to the podium and said the words that ended my family's entire world. "Please welcome the Director of National Cyber Defense Operations." I watched my father's water glass slip out of his hand and shatter across the table. I watched my brother's face turn the color of chalk. I watched my mother clutch her chest like she couldn't breathe. I stepped up to that podium in front of every senator, general, and defense contractor in the room, and I didn't raise my voice once. Tonight, I said, we're going to talk about the Iron Veil Initiative. And we're going to talk about loyalty, and what happens to people who sell this country out for a bigger house. I hit a button. The screens behind me lit up with the corrupted source code, the offshore transfers, the video of my brother explaining exactly how he planned to frame me. A collective gasp rippled through the entire ballroom as senior military officials realized what they were actually looking at. This contract, I said, is permanently vetoed under my authority, effective immediately. And under the direct provisions of federal espionage law, this is no longer a corruption case. This is a case of high treason. The doors burst open. A dozen federal agents in tactical gear flooded in from every exit. My brother tried to run and got tackled before he made it 5 feet, screaming that he had lawyers, that this was illegal, that nobody could touch him. My father was still frozen at his chair when the 2 lead agents reached him. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his tuxedo and slammed him face first onto the very table where his own water glass had just shattered, down into the spilled wine, the broken crystal, the ruins of a dinner he'd never finish. He turned his cheek against the linen just far enough to look up at me. "Mia, please," he begged, his voice cracking apart in front of every senator and general in that room. "You have the authority. Make this stop. We're blood. Families protect each other." It was almost funny, hearing him invoke loyalty after a week of proving he had none. I looked down at him, this man who had spent my entire childhood making me feel invisible, who 1 week earlier had told me I was erased from this family forever, and I felt nothing but a strange, quiet stillness. "You told me a week ago I was erased from this family," I said, loud enough for every camera in that room to catch it. "I'm just following your instructions. I'm not your daughter tonight. I'm the director, and directors don't hand out pardons to people who sell out their own country." They hauled him up and dragged him out, still screaming my name. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the room went completely, permanently silent. Here's how it ended, if you're wondering. My brother took a plea deal rather than risk trial. Life in federal prison, no parole, permanently barred from the financial industry, and completely erased from the world he'd spent his whole career building. My father was convicted on 41 separate counts, including bribery and treason. No bail was granted, and he's spending what's left of his life fighting appeals from a cell that doesn't care whose name is on the door. My sister-in-law had every asset seized within minutes of the arrest, the jewelry, the cars, the Aspen property, and was indicted separately for tax fraud. My mom lost the house, the friends, the whole shining fantasy she built her identity around, and now lives quietly, alone, in an apartment about the size of the closet she used to keep her furs in. And Curtis, the mole in my own office? He didn't get a plea deal either. Betraying national security doesn't come with a discount. A year later, I stood on a balcony overlooking the city with General Reeves, 2 glasses of champagne between us, watching the lights of Washington glow like nothing had ever happened. "To absolute clarity," he said, raising his glass. I raised mine right back. 'Cause for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't performing for anyone. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit at a table that never actually wanted me there. I finally understood something that took 31 years and 1 federal indictment to learn. The people who make you feel small are usually the ones most afraid of what happens when you finally stand up straight. I still think about Grandpa Walt's farmhouse sometimes. I drove up there not long after the sentencing, sat on the porch he built with his own hands, and finally understood what he meant all those summers ago. The loudest people in my family were never the dangerous ones. I was. They just never bothered to look closely enough to notice, and by the time they did, it was already far too late for any of them to do a single thing about it. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. Drop a comment and tell me. Would you have shown mercy, or would you have let the whole thing burn exactly like I did? Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because Silent Revenge has a lot more receipts to show you. And remember, the people who underestimate you today are usually the ones writing your origin story without even realizing it. See you in the next one.